Hey everybody, this is Brandon here from Terrain Academy, and today I'm going to show you how I built this magical hot spring. Alright, so to get started, I'm just going to be using a coaster here as a guide to cut some circles out of some XPS foam. It's called extruded polystyrene. At this stage, I'm not trying to make anything look super neat. I'm just trying to get the rough shapes. We're going to be covering up all of this later on with some Sculptamold and a whole bunch of other different plasters and things like that. This is really just more like the foundation to your house. You can go ahead and mess around with different shapes and whatnot for whatever you're doing, but don't worry about being too neat. You really don't need it to be. I'm wearing a mask while I do this, and you should too. The chemicals that come out from this are really bad for you, so wear a mask and be in a well-ventilated area. Here's the base layer after a couple of minutes of messing things around. And I kept that up for a little bit, and here we are with the second layer. I'm trying to build a nice little ramp out there, and again, it doesn't need to be neat here. It just sort of needs to be roughly shaped. The plaster and Sculptamold are going to really put this thing together. Speaking of covering this thing, we're going to now be mixing up some plaster to make some rock molds that are going to cover the outside of all this. And basically to mix this Plaster of Paris here, it's about a 50-50 mix of water and plaster, and you just kind of pour it in. You're going to get sort of this weird soupy goopy texture, and you want to start with less and then just add more water as you go until you get the desired texture. Next, we're going to be using some Sculptamold. This is another sculpting putty, and you're going to want to get this into about the texture of cottage cheese, which you mix with about 50% of the putty and 50% water. And you know, to some people, I'm sure Sculptamold probably tastes better than cottage cheese too. We're going to be taking this and smoothing this up along the outside, and we're going to then be taking these rocks that we made with the Plaster of Paris from before, and finding good spots to put in these rocks. And once you find a nice spot, all you're going to be doing is then using a combination of some sort of glue. In this case, PVA glue works best, also known as Elmer's glue. Put it in a nice place that you want. Put down a little bit of the Sculptamold, help hold it in place. And then we'll be putting the rock right on top. And then once we have it on top in the place that we want it to be, we just take the same Sculptamold and just fill in a lot of the outside areas. Now you're probably thinking to yourself, hey, that looks pretty terrible. And you're right. But here's the thing with terrain building, and really a lot of other things in life. It looks bad for a really long time, and then you hit a point in the process, and all of a sudden it starts to look pretty good. I call that part turning the corner, and we're definitely not there yet. So if you're building or painting something and you're discouraged, don't give up yet. It will get better. After a while, this is how it looked, and at this point, I was starting to feel all right. I could tell that, at least structure-wise, I think this was going to be pretty good. After this, I finished covering the rest of it up to the top in pretty much the same fashion up to this point. Next step was airbrushing. I recently got this airbrush from my friend Andrew. Thanks, Andrew. Here, I'm using some artist inks, specifically Liquitex, and I'm first just base coating it with white, black, and gray. I'm trying to create what is called a zenithal highlight. First, I'm going over the whole thing with a light gray. Then after that, I'm going to be going over the shadowy parts on the underside where there wouldn't be a lot of light with darker colors, like black specifically, and darker shades of gray, and then going all over the top where light would shine with white. This helps highlight the whole piece and really brings out the colors in a subtle way when you're going over it with the real colors that you want to be on the piece. After I did all that, I then went over with a fairly light gray, once again using inks, but also starting to mix in a little bit of actual brown paint in the final step. Right now, I'm just going over with a really watered down yellow. This is a good painting tip in general. Always use very watered down coats and layers. It's better to have many thin coats than to have one thick coat that takes out a bunch of detail. Here you can see me now just kind of going crazy with the light colors, so much so that I let it drip all down the thing. It's a little messy, but that's alright. I'm going to use it and move it around and it'll be okay. You can afford to be a little bit sloppy in this process. Once I coated over the whole thing, I'm now going to be using a brown wash. This one in particular, for the beginning, is Army Painter brown wash, but I have made my own, and you can see lots of guides on the internet about how to make your own washes. I'm going to be focusing explicitly on the shadows and the corners and nooks and crannies, though eventually I will be coating almost all of this with at least a light layer of the wash. The wash seeps into cracks and really brings out the shadows and the depth. It takes something from being average to looking great, and is exactly what I was talking about earlier. Next, for this step, we're going to be doing what's called dry brushing. I have this big brush, and you could actually even use a makeup brush if you wanted to. You're going to try and take the wet brush and get almost all the paint out of it using a paper towel or a piece of cardboard in order to get it to be very dry. Then we're basically just going to lightly brush this over the top of almost the entire surface, but sticking closely to the areas that are going to be hit by light. What dry brushing does is it brings out the edges and makes it look really nice. With the dry brushing highlights and the shadows, you could really see that this is starting to become much more of a defined piece with some real definition. Alright, and so earlier I did try and color in the bottom of the pool, but now we're going to make it a little bit more refined. I'm going to paint over the edges with a watered down brown that's as close to the color that we have for the rest of the diorama. Afterwards, I'm going to mix a little bit of green and blue, and I'm going to try and go right underneath this line that I made with that blue-green color of the water and blend the two. It's a little bright, but once I blend them and mush them in with each other, it's going to look good. I hope. Yeah, that turned out all right. I'm just going to repeat that on the other side, and then we'll be moving on to the next step. Finally, we get to the fun part. We're going to make the water, and for this I'm going to be using Envirotex Light. It is a 2-part resin. All of these work the same. You're ultimately going to mix these two different resins together, the resin and the hardener. Each kit has its own, or each company, each resin has its own instructions, so if you do this, just be sure to read yours. And after mixing them up, we're going to put them into one cup, mix them together. And for colors, I'm going to be using the Liquitex inks. I'm going to be using a drop of green and a drop of blue. And a little bit goes a long way with these things. But before I fill in the water, I'm going to be making the waterfalls. Now, in hindsight, I should have poured the water almost immediately, but I was worried about putting in the waterfall pieces and having it not work in with the water. But I'll get to that later. To make these waterfalls, all you take is cotton swabs, and you're going to dunk them in the resin just like this. Once you've placed it on the spots where you want it, just use some tweezers and some toothpicks and put it in place and kind of poke it around and guide it. It actually does a very good job of staying in the spot that you want it to. I learned this trick from Neil at Real Terrain Hobbies. Definitely go check out his video. I'll link it in the description. And here is the big mistake I was talking about. I should have poured that resin earlier, and now I saw that it actually hardened and got a lot of bubbles in it. So frantically, I just threw it in, but alas, the bubbles were stuck. And what could have been a nice, beautiful water ended up being this weird, bubbly thing. Oh well. I won't lie, I was pretty upset when this happened, but I decided I liked so many other parts of this piece that I needed to find a way to make it work. I suppose since it was a hot springs, maybe the bubbles would make sense. So to try and fix this, I decide I'm going to put a lot of white water on. It's already going to need a little bit to make the water look better, but we're going to go crazy with it. Here I'm pouring over Mod Podge and blowing it with an airbrush. This makes ripple effects like you'd see on water. Honestly, I just end up going kind of crazy with this and blow it in all these different directions. It's going to be translucent, and so it really ends up being a subtle effect in the end anyway. Here's the final result before it dries. Next, I'm going to cut down the edges created by the water from the waterfalls. I'm just using a utility knife to cut down the corners. Next, to really build up some of the water, I'm going to be using some Vallejo water texture, and I'm also going to try mixing it with some snow. I've seen people with ocean dioramas mix some snow flock into their water effects, and that makes sort of a whitewater effect. And given that I don't like all these bubbles that I've made, I'm going to try and cover it up with a lot of whitewater. To cover up all the bubbles that I made, I'm going to try and cover them up with this sort of whitewater. I've never done this before, so it could look really bad, but then again, most of the things I'm doing in this video, I've never done before. Here I am sampling it on some cardboard, and, well, it looks okay. Hopefully it'll look alright on the diorama. I'm just taking a popsicle stick here, and I'm going to be pushing it on. By the way, if you don't have any popsicle sticks, I have to recommend them as one of the best tools for making terrain. I'm trying to push it around in a couple layers. At first I had two, and then I decided to push back into one. Now I'm going to be going over it with a very light ghostly blue. My goal is to highlight the water edges just like we did on the terrain. First with the light blue, then I'm going to be over with a white, with a very, very slight bit of blue in it. Here you're going to see me again getting it extremely dry. You'll see what happens if your brush is not dry enough in a minute. Be careful, as sometimes hairs fall off your brush. At this point, I'm actually starting to feel a little bit more optimistic about this water. I feel like I had fixed this big mistake that I made. In fact, I get so into it that I maybe put a little bit too much color on. There you can see I accidentally smudged a little bit of the white color, the white paint. Ugh. Try and fix this up a little bit and blend a little bit of the harsh edges to make more soft transitions. And, it's okay. Personally, I think it looks better in the camera. But that's alright, as long as you guys think it looks good. You don't have to know that it actually looks a lot worse in real life. Now I'm going to go over with just some white brushes and do some edge highlights. Now, although I technically did this before doing the paint, I am going to show you the last step of just adding a few spots of color. I was thinking about going over this with a lot of flock to have a lot of greenery all over, as not all deserts are completely dry, but I decided to keep it very, very minimal. Finally, the last step is just to add a black base to it. And here we are as the final result. Overall, I'm actually pretty happy with this thing. The water is, at least in the basin, is leaves something to be desired for me, but the waterfalls came out absolutely beautiful. However, the pathway and the rock structure itself is my favorite part. And I'm very happy with the color, the shading, and the shape. Here's a final look. Thank you all for watching this video. I really hope that you enjoyed it. If you did, let me know down in the comments. Let me know if there's anything that I can improve on. It's my first video, so probably a little clunky, but that's all right. I had a lot of fun with it, and I hope to be making more in the future. So until then, I'll see you next time.